So my name is Ian Armit. I'm a professor of archaeology at the University of York, and mostly I study later Bronze Age and Iron Age societies of Europe, with a particular interest in Britain. And I'm also interested in the prehistory of conflict and violence in small-scale societies.
I'm David Reich. I'm a professor of genetics at Harvard, and I study ancient DNA and try to use ancient DNA to learn about population history, movements of people, and mixtures, or lack thereof.
So the Beaker complex, in terms of the British Isles, is really the name that we give to the major change in material culture that happens around 2450 BC, when we see in Britain the appearance of single inhumation graves, so individual people being buried in elaborate graves, quite often with quite rich objects. We see the first evidence of copper metallurgy, archery equipment coming in, and what gives it its name is the appearance of these small, highly decorated beaker vessels, which were probably used as drinking vessels.
As soon as the Beaker period arrives in Britain, every single genetic individual we analyzed, and we now have many, many dozens, and in fact hundreds over a longer time frame, has a very different genetic ancestry profile with, again, a minimum of 90% population displacement. It's extremely dramatic, and it's very tempting at first blush to assume that this is due to large scale and complete almost displacement from the continent at this time.
So debates over how the Beaker complex comes into Britain have been raging amongst archaeologists really for more than a century. And it's broadly divided into two camps. For a long time, it was really assumed that the Beakers arrived here as part of some form of migration, the so-called Beaker Folk. However, really over recent decades, as in archaeology more generally, attitudes have moved away from using migrations as a kind of automatic form of explanation. And people have thought much more about other ways in which the Beaker complex might have arrived. So, for example, through the spread of ideas, perhaps through the spread of new religious beliefs, because we see changes in burial practice, for example. So we've had this divergence of opinion for a long, long time, unresolved between migration on the one hand and the spread of ideas on the other. There really has to be some link between the appearance of the Beaker complex and this huge genetic turnover that we see in this period. But it's important, I think, for archaeologists not to simply say, okay, it's migration, it's the old Beaker folk that we used to talk about back in the 1930s, sort of coming in and simply dominating the preceding population. The challenge for archaeologists really is to problematize this situation and to start to think about, well, what does this actually mean in terms of correlation and causation between the Beaker complex and migration? So, for example, we have a problem that the Neolithic population prior to the arrival of the Beaker complex seems to have been probably much lower than it had been before. And in fact, as a result of that, and as a result of the nature of burial practices, we have very few samples for the few centuries immediately preceding the Beaker complex. So if, for example, this genetic change had started to happen earlier, then there's a good chance that we would not necessarily be seeing that at the moment. So rather than simply saying, okay, well, now we have the answer to this whole question, what we have are a whole series of new questions that we really have to start to resolve. I think here we have to think about a whole load of issues that we haven't really thought about before. You know, what new populations occupying these long, previously occupied landscapes? How do these new societies constitute themselves in these new locations? What do they make of the landscapes they encounter? How do they re-inhabit them, reinterpret them? How do they integrate with the people who are already there? There's a whole range of questions that we really haven't thought about, which we're now challenged to do by the genetic data.
In Iberia, around exactly the same time, we see actually a dramatic change also with not a minimum 90% replacement or displacement, but more a 40% one. But there we see hundreds of years of coexistence of the local population and the incoming population before they collapse into each other 400 or 500 years later and thoroughly mix. It's possible that we are seeing that in Iberia, but not in Britain, because in Iberia, there do continue to be inhumations through this time. And so there's a period of overlap. So that one question is how long this process takes, and is there an invisible local British population that takes some time to absorb? It's possible not, but we don't yet know the answer. Had several close collaborations with archaeologists like this. And the best ones, and in all cases, have ended up in not just the primary research papers, but these additional papers that discuss in the broader archaeological context, the meaning, the nuances, the issues, the models that may or may not be associated with the genetic findings in a way that is more directed to the archaeological community than the genetic paper can be by itself, which necessarily needs to speak to multiple audiences at once. I think it really enhances the impact of the genetic study by itself. I think the two together are more than it would be the case if we just had that genetic paper.
I think it's really important when we have these big collaborative projects that, I mean, by the nature of the genetic data, the primary publication vehicle for the data itself is very often in a big interdisciplinary journal, Nature in the case of the data we used for the Beaker project. But very often those sorts of papers don't really allow the room or the space to actually develop some of the more detailed archaeological arguments to reflect on the histories of debate and the way in which the data feeds into the different perspectives that we've taken within these debates. So I think it's really important to have these multiple publications that do come together to really delve into the detail of this material and what it can tell us.
I see myself right now as someone who is working on a method that, of all things that archaeology is engaged with, is most similar to radiocarbon dating or maybe to stable isotopic analysis, which at the beginning of this work was the province of technical experts like myself, and eventually began to be something that was more in the hands of archaeologists themselves that's learned in graduate school. Of course, ancient DNA is rather complicated, and it may never be the case that a standard part of training for archaeologists will be to master all the nuances of it. However, I do think that in 10 years' time or 5 years' time, it will be the case that these projects will be crafted primarily by archaeologists, and it will be more the case that ancient DNA specialists like myself will be helping the archaeologists do that work. I think that's as it should be. My goal here is to help midwife this work to one that archaeologists can control, but and drive. But one thing that needs to happen is that we need to work at the beginning of this process with archaeologists who will lean into the process themselves, who will not just be passive, but who will work with people like myself to identify problems, to identify specimens that will answer important problems, to actively contribute to the interpretation, to write ancillary interpretive articles like the one that we published in Antiquity that translate the work.
Really, when we were thinking about where to put out a paper that really dealt with the real detail of the genetic evidence of what it might mean archaeologically, Antiquity did seem like the obvious vehicle for that. It attracts a global audience, and although this paper is dealing with specifically British instance, it's an instance of a much wider issue. And I think we hope that this paper would act as a little bit of an exemplar to others and perhaps encourage that sort of engagement between archaeologists and geneticists in other parts of the world with other genetic sets of data which can be interpreted and addressed in the same sort of way.
I'm very happy to have been involved in this paper published in Antiquity. I think that one thing that I've noticed archaeologists often feel a little bit uncomfortable with is that these papers that bear on archaeology are published in journals that are not native to the archaeological community, in Cell sometimes, or in Science or Nature and Current Biology, the preferred journals of the molecular biology community. And I think it's very respectful to come and not only publish in those journals, but to publish in the journals in the field whose questions are being addressed. And hopefully that will contribute to this work being better received and integrated. And part of the reason I'm so thrilled to have this prize is that at least in this case, that's a recognition that here that's at least partially successful.